The Masonic Lodge in Copenhagen is located at the south end of Fælledparken, just down the street from the location of an ancient star fort surrounding the new Vartov Hospital. The curious thing about Copenhagen's Masonic Hall is that it displays its logo upside down, and that could mean many things, but I speculated in a previous video that the logo could be signaling direction, that of building down rather than up. Today, the Masonic Lodge is just down the street, but in the other direction, from a different hospital, the Rigshospitalet, or Kingdom Hospital. In the 1990s, it was the spooky setting of a Danish television series called The Kingdom. The show's premise was that this modern hospital had been built over old ponds of water, bleaching ponds that existed in Fælledparken in the 1700s. This illustration shows the connecting ponds with the bleached fabrics laying out in the grass to dry.
Grunden under Rigshospitalet er gammel mose. Her lå blejedammene engang. Her gik blegemændene og fugtede deres store lærreder i det lave vand for at lægge til plejning. Fordampningen indhyllede stedet i en permanent tåge. Senere byggedes Rigshospitalet her, og blegemændene blev skiftet ud med læger og forskere og landets bedste hjerner og mest fuldendte teknologi. Og som kronen på værket kaldte man stedet for riget. Nu skulle livet defineres, og uvidenhed og overtro aldrig mere kunne ryste videnskaben. Måske er det blevet for meget med hovmodet og den konsekvente fornægtelse af det åndelige. For det er som om kulden og fugten er vendt tilbage.
The implication in the show was that the medical crimes and unethical procedures taking place were inspired by an evil spirit that haunts the site of the bleaching ponds, suggesting the old ponds were the site of something lurid. Perhaps a place where dead bodies were dumped, to be dissolved by the bleaching lye. I'm not sure the real bleaching ponds spawned evil, but I am running down a theory that the ponds had something to do with the Vartov hospitals and the Masons who later relocated their Grand Lodge here. New Vartov sat at the location where the Triangeln intersection is today, and while the creator of Kingdom, Lars von Trier, may be right in suggesting that certain things were going on at Rigshospitalet, I think there's an equally problematic history of New Vartov. However, before we can really understand New Vartov, we need to first understand Old Vartov. The Vartov Hospital at Triangeln was the second Vartov of three. The first was located well north of Fælledparken, at the Vartov farm in Hellerup. And the third was located in central Copenhagen, near Tivoli and the west gate of the city's old fortified wall. In these two maps from the 1700s, Vartov is already described as Gammel or Old Vartov because the new Vartov had already been established further south, on the Sortedam in 1630. The Gammel Vartov farm was east of Rue Vangen or Rue Field. The building shown here was originally called Rosbæk Inn and was built in 1585. It was located near the Rosbæk Mill. Google Maps shows the two street names of Rosbæk and Gammel Vartov pinpointing the area and placing the mill around here and the hospital down here. The hospital building survived until the 1960s, and these are photographs of Gamovartov from 1905 through the 1950s before it was demolished. In 1590, the building's name was changed to Vartov, and 15 years later, in 1606, the Heligand Hospital moved its poor residents here. A small booklet on Vartov Kirka tells us this was done because King Christian IV wanted to use the current hospital, Heligandhuset, to house orphans, so the sick residents of the hospital were relocated to the king's farm at Vartov. Historian H.U. Ramsing writes in Historical Announcements about Copenhagen that at the founding of 30 November 1607, the hospital's obligation to admit orphans had lapsed, as King Christian IV had decided to establish a new orphanage on the hospital grounds and with the use of its buildings. The old Heligand Hospital was now moved to the Royal Pleasure Farm Vartov on the Strandvej. We can see the Rosbeck Mill depicted on both of these maps, and neither one shows the mill bearing any wind sails, suggesting it may have been a water mill. In this book by Jens Peter Trapp, published in 1898, we read that, quote, "At the southeastern boundary of the parish, where the Little Rosbeck runs, lay in the 16th century a mill, Rosbeck Mill, which was later transformed into a royal pleasure farm, where a guest house was set up in 1585, which by 1590 was given the name Vartov." The Little Rosbeck would be the Little Ross Creek, and it likely ran from the natural spring source that existed on the land of Gamovartov. Like most springs, the Gamovartov spring was believed to be medicinal, and this may have been why the inn evolved into a hospital. Again, we read in Trapp's 1898 book, "It is not the Kirsten Pill spring, but the medical spring Vartov Kilden, which was located by Strandvejen, a few hundred steps from Gamovartov." Because Gamovartov was one of several royal mill farms, it's possible that Rosbeck Mill performed military functions. Gamovartov farm was later sold to private owners, but we're told in the Dansk Biografisk Lexicon that it was eventually sold back to the state and that the military set up a gunpowder drying magazine there. It's possible, then, that the water mill might have functioned as a krutmill or gunpowder mill. According to Sproget.dk, a krutmill was a factory that produced gunpowder by means of power from a water mill. If so, this is likely why a gunpowder magazine was also built there. A gunpowder magazine is a building in which gunpowder is stored, and keeping the gunpowder dry in the building's cellar required either lime chloride, or calcium chloride. Left in an open box, the lye would absorb any moisture in the building, and calcium chloride was a simple byproduct of lime chloride, or bleaching powder. Which brings us back to Vartov No. 2, or New Vartov, located right next to what would later become the bleaching ponds of Fellidparken. In 1630, the residents moved from Gamovartov down to New Vartov, a place described in this book as a large farm which included hospital and barn, and which was built in a fortress. The nearby bleaching ponds were using the very same resources that Gamovartov would have used in the drying of gunpowder, so it's not unreasonable to think that the New Vartov complex was also storing gunpowder. Perhaps as the calcium chloride became saturated in the drying process, it was dumped into the nearby ponds in the park, and the cloth workers then made use of it in their own way. New Vartov had been designed and built 7 years earlier, in 1623, by Christian IV's master builder, Hans von Steenwinkel the Younger. His father, Hans the Elder, had been a master builder for Christian's father, Frederick II. As I discussed in an earlier video, Hans the Elder came to Denmark in the 1570s to work on Kronborg Castle, but was called away to help Tycho Brahe with Uraniborg, a clearly mud-flooded and Tartarian-looking castle on the nearby island of Ven in what is now Sweden. There's no documented evidence that either Steenwinkle was a Freemason because most of that documentation didn't begin until the English Lodge presented itself in 1717. But in this video, I speculated that Christian IV was introduced to Freemasonry around 1606, when he visited England and where he likely spent much time with King James I and Sir Francis Bacon, the driving force of speculative Freemasonry at that time. Jake Roberts of the Ghosts of Bacon has decrypted ciphers indicating that Francis Bacon was the son of Mary Queen of Scots and King Francis II of France, making Francis Bacon and King James I half-brothers. The two were very close, and it's likely that James was not only aware, but also involved with Bacon's Masonic work. James was also the brother-in-law of Denmark's King Christian IV, whose sister Anne had married James and was now the Queen of England. And Christian would have spent time with both James and Francis Bacon on his visit to England in 1606. So it's also likely he brought some Masonic ideals and secrets back to Denmark at this time. In support of this theory, a claim made by the 1723 Constitution's website states that, in the library of the National Grand Lodge of Denmark, is preserved an old manuscript from the year 1800 with the title Authentic History of the Freemasons. In this, it is alleged that one or more lodges existed in Denmark as early as in 1612. Both Steenwinkles, the elder and younger, were considered master builders, and Hans the Younger designed the New Vartov building with an undercroft very similar to the one his father had worked on in Uraniborg, and in which Tycho Brahe housed his alchemical laboratory. This illustration of the vaulted undercroft of Uraniborg's cellar was actually drawn by Hans the Elder. The care that went into these cellars may have been the nascence of the upside-down Masonic symbolism in Denmark, signifying that building underground spaces would have special significance, especially if secretive activities like alchemical labs were to be housed there. In his essay On Building, Francis Bacon mentions the importance of a palace cellar, to have at the further end a winter and a summer parlor, both fair, and under these rooms a fair and large cellar sunk underground, and likewise some privy kitchens with butteries and pantries and the like. The description of the cellar at New Vartov is much the same. The block of the main complex, whose cellars had vaults supported by hewn stone pillars, contained rooms for the sick, kitchen, and housing. The main difference, though, was that New Vartov was not a palace. It was a hospital for the poor. So why all this effort and expense? A building described as magnificent, with hewn stone cellars and a star fortification around it, if its only purpose was to house and care for the poor. One possible answer is that the Danish king thought a hospital for the poor would be a good hiding place for his ammunition, especially since he was already in the habit of hiding artillery and ordnance in unlikely buildings. In 1877, Danish artillery captain Otto Blom wrote that, by carefully examining the surviving artillery accounts from King Christian IV's time, one soon becomes aware that already at the transition from the 16th to the 17th century, and probably sometime before, Copenhagen's Tøjhus, or cloth house, had developed into what it has later consistently been, namely the kingdom's main arsenal, the most important hiding place for the crown's arms supply. In addition to this, both Denmark and Sweden had hidden gunpowder in breweries. Blom also writes that the town of Malmö in Sweden must have had its own gunpowder mill as early as 1524, since it is mentioned in a letter from this year. In 1547, strangely enough, the city's brewery decided to keep gunpowder and weights on the city mayor's behalf. Elsewhere in the book, Blom states that the brewery was ordered to do so. The brewery ordnance combination is noteworthy, considering that Gamelvartov butted up to the original farmland owned by the Tuborg farm that would later form one of the country's largest breweries. In fact, Gamelvartov was demolished in 1961 for the building of Tuborg's administration building. If the Crown was hiding gunpowder in a hospital for the poor, that might explain why a hospital for the poor was placed inside a star fort. It might also explain the large amounts of lye available for the cloth bleaching industry in Fælledparken. I mentioned in an earlier video that there was a similar situation going on in London at the same time, involving Charterhouse, another hospital for the poor. Charterhouse was a former Carthusian monastery that had been closed down during Henry VIII's violent dissolution of the monasteries. In 1611, Charterhouse was incorporated into a school for boys and a hospital or almshouse for older men. But like New Vartov in Copenhagen, hospitality may not have been its only function. In about 1620, Sir Francis Bacon, who was then Lord Chancellor of England, addressed Parliament about Charterhouse, which had been founded and incorporated in 1611 by a man named Thomas Sutton. The King, my royal master, was lately graciously pleased to move some discourse to me concerning Mr. Sutton's hospital, and such like worthy foundations of memorable piety, which humbly seconded by myself, drew His Majesty into a serious consideration of the mineral treasures of his own territories. As the most probable means to relieve all the poor thereof without any other stock or benevolence than that which divine bounty should confer on their own industries and honest labors, in recovering all such drowned mineral works as have been or shall be, therefore, deserted. Outwardly, this was a request for authorization to use prisoners and poorhouse residents as labor for the King's mining operations. But this outward meaning was concealing a much more pressing fact, that Mr. Sutton's hospital was actually a store of deserted minerals. Sutton was a wealthy man and financially capable of purchasing this old monastery, but I suspect that he was chosen to incorporate the monastery as a hospital because he was also a former Master General of the Ordnance in the North for the British military. I've mentioned this word a few times already, but ordnance, according to Oxford English Dictionary's Lexico, is a branch of the armed forces dealing with the supply and storage of weapons, ammunition, and related equipment. So it's not unreasonable to think the plan here was to use the Charterhouse complex as a gunpowder magazine, disguised as a hospital for the poor. What confirms this, for me anyway, is a cryptic but now much more obvious letter from Francis Bacon to the King shortly after the untimely death of Mr. Sutton, who is now no longer able to tend any hidden ordnance at Charterhouse. This cometh into my mind upon this act of Mr. Sutton, which seemeth to me as a sacrifice without salt, having the materials of a good intention, but not powdered with any such ordinances and institutions as may preserve the same from turning corrupt, or at least from becoming unsavory and of little use. The word ordnance is very close to the word ordnance, and what is powdered ordnance if not gunpowder? I believe that in this letter, Bacon has encoded the message that there was gunpowder stored at Charterhouse that needed to be moved because it was not being preserved or kept dry, with the byproduct of bleaching powder. And considering the fact that gunpowder contains the minerals of potassium nitrate and sulfur, It could literally be described as wet or drowned mineral works, which is exactly how Bacon had described it to Parliament. The possibility that this hospital was functioning as something else is practically admitted in Bacon's letter, when he mentions that these are hospitals in name only. As it comes to pass in diverse hospitals of this realm, which have but the names of hospitals, and are but wealthy benefices, in respect of the mastership, but the poor, which is the propter quid, little relieved. History tells us that when Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries, he used Charterhouse to store his tents and pavilions from the field of cloth and gold. If so, this may have begun a sort of tradition of hiding ammunition with textiles, as we learned earlier regarding the Danish royal cloth house. In fact, it's noteworthy how ordnance has been repeatedly paired with the manufacture, storage, and bleaching of cloth. The Charterhouse plans show several features that would have made it useful for the storage of ordnance. What most maps label as the Bowling Green, these plans indicate was a large octagonal reservoir. As well as a smaller reservoir next to its brewery. Below the Charterhouse there were also kitchen and buttery cellars. And on the Icy Sedgwick blog, a comment under a post on Charterhouse mentions the tunnels. I grew up in the Charterhouse, 1950 to 1958. I was 9 when my father got his job back after the war as a gardener handyman. I was a boy, the only one there, and explored the many tunnels and rooms that were underneath Charterhouse, and were only opened by the bombing of London during the war that loosened up and revealed many ways of accessing the secret underground of Charterhouse that also led to the Barbican tube tunnels and the underground sewers of London, plus connected with many other bombed ruins of the city, even underground canalways. I spent many hours exploring underground, but by 1955 these areas were being rebuilt, filled in, and blocked off. In the Charterhouse Chapel, still today we can see the crescent symbol, perhaps an early representation of what would later become the Masonic branch of the Shriners, known for its hospitals for children. In the 20th century, the upside-down Masons of Copenhagen would build their Grand Lodge, or Stamhus, just feet from the site of New Vartov, and we see a similar crescent and star symbol hidden at the last or third Vartov hospital. The poor residents of New Vartov were moved inside the city walls after the second Vartov hospital was destroyed in 1658 during the Swedish siege. This third Vartov is the current Vartov you can still visit today. It opened around 1665, but while the second Vartov was situated next to bleaching ponds, the third Vartov was established in the opposite situation. It was located on Farvergade, meaning Color Street, and the hospital took over an old royal dye house where cloth was color-stained rather than bleached. Christian IV later established an orphanage and discipline house here, where children produced clothing for the military. But Vartov was known for most of its history as a nursing home and chapel. The Vartov building was located right next to the city wall's Gildenlove Bastion and the Lucy Mill. Through the 1700s, there were about 20 mills on the city's ramparts, likely serving military functions. It would seem less likely that the Danish military would be housing ammunition at this Vartov, since it was in such an urban area. But excavations in its garden in 1927 showed a layer of beechwood charcoal in the soil, which may indicate the production of gunpowder at one time. The well-known Danish priest, philosopher, and author of hymns, Nikolai Grundtvig, preached in the Vartov Chapel from 1839 to 1872. The altarpiece shown behind him features a very Masonic, all-seeing eye in the center of a pyramid. When the Vartov Hospital separated from the chapel, the west end of the building was used by the Radhuset, or town hall, for the city of Copenhagen. And we're told that this tunnel was built in 1933 to connect the two buildings. This is the coat of arms designed to hang above the entrance. And this is the design of a screen for a flue pipe, both designs featuring a crescent and star. Again bringing to mind the Masonic branch of the Shriners and its hospitals for children. The Shriners were formed in 1870, and since the 1920s, the group's charitable cause has been its hospitals for children, especially those suffering from crippling diseases like polio. In Denmark, 3 hospitals were built in the 19th century near Trianglen, the site of New Vartov, and like the Shriners' hospitals, these were also treating children with polio. All 3 were built, however, in response to the 1853 cholera epidemic in Copenhagen. The Kommune Hospital, built in 1863, Dronning Louise's Børnehospitalet, built in 1879, and Blydam Hospitalet, built in 1880. Rigshospitalet in Fælledparken wouldn't be established until 1910, though the hospital had been in existence since 1757 in a different location. And just for reference, the Masonic Lodge was built in Fælledparken in 1928. It was the 1853 outbreak of cholera, the result of unsanitary water, that caused the city's ramparts to be decommissioned and mostly dismantled. But many sections of the city's moat remained, despite the fact that many people had dumped their sewage in the moats a decade earlier. 2 of the hospitals built near Trianglen, the children's and city hospitals, were built in close proximity to the moats. Kommune Hospitalet opened 10 years after the epidemic, in 1863. It was located just west of the section of moat above Rosenborg Castle. And Dronning Louise, the children's hospital, was built in 1879 just north of another section of moat. The 2 were within blocks of one another. Blydam Hospitalet was built in 1880. Its Danish name actually means Bleaching Ponds Hospital, and it was built on a plot of land that belonged to the Danish Ministry of War, land that also may have been used previously, or even subsequently, for the storage of ammunition. Each of these 3 hospitals made innovative progress in allopathic healthcare, but each also had unfortunate incidents involving their younger patients. Dronning Louise had a very high mortality rate, and its ventilation system had been improperly installed, leading to an infestation of a wood-decaying fungus. And the hospital's treatments and protocols in 1929 seem, frankly, bizarre. Kommune Hospitalet was implicated in the 1960s of experimenting on Danish orphans, conducting psychological experiments on the children in the hospital basement, in a project that was funded by the American CIA. At the Bleaching Ponds Hospital, experiments were conducted on polio-afflicted children using chlorine dioxide. And in the Kingdom TV show, the little girl named Mary, who haunts the elevator shaft, was said to have died in the hospital basement, where she was poisoned with chlorine gas. In the fictional story, this was to have happened in the 1920s, but a polio outbreak occurred in Copenhagen in 1952, and in a strange coincidence, the Polio Institute was built a few years later on the former land of the Tuborg farm, just 2 blocks away from Gamle Vartov. Today, the three hospitals, Kommunehospitalet, Dronning Louise Borne-Hospitalet, and Blijdam-Hospitalet, have all been closed down. Only the Rigshospitalet remains. When it was being rebuilt in the 1960s, excavation revealed this bricked-off tunnel door from one of its connecting buildings, and half of the Kingdom television show took place in a corresponding fictional underground network of basement passageways.
Sundhedsministeren vil gerne starte i kælderen. Kælderen her, den har ingen som helst relevans hverken til Operation Morgenluft eller til afdelingen. De møder ingen af mine folk dernede. Lad os nu bare begynde i kælderen, når sundhedsministeren gerne vil have det. Ikke? For ham der er der noget mystisk og noget labyrintisk over kælderen. Og jeg har fortalt, at vi har 30 kilometer gange alt i alt.
One example of the use of such passageways is illustrated when Dr. Helmer is being investigated for causing brain damage while operating on a young female patient. In order to hide her from the authorities there to investigate her condition, he makes use of the hospital's dumbwaiter system that travels to different buildings in the complex. And the basement level of the hospital becomes very important with respect to the legal concept of jurisdiction. When one of the Kingdom doctors wants to perform an extremely unethical surgical operation on himself in order to gain legal custody of a cancerous liver.
Den eneste legale og etisk forsvarlige måde at komme i besiddelse af hepatosarkomet på er en transplantation til mig selv. Hvis leveren indopereres og fungerer der i blot få minutter, vil ejendomsretten til vævet være overgået til mig.
He's able to convince his fellow doctors to steal a liver and transplant it into his body because they're all brothers in a secret fraternity. It's a sort of antithesis to the Masonic Lodge because the doctors' fraternity rejects any occult beliefs that might be typically associated with Freemasons. But what the two lodges do share in common is a focus on legal jurisdictions.
Ved Dr. Krogshøjs hjælp har jeg opnået adgang til nødhospitalet, som ligger i en kælderetage under hospitalet.
In order to perform the operation in their own self-defined legal manner, the doctors in the Lodge of Rigshospitalet must change the location of the surgery from the jurisdiction of Kingdom Hospital to that of the Civil Defense Hospital below ground. It's a distinction similar to the jurisdictional layers here in the US of soil, which holds a national jurisdiction, and the land beneath, which holds an international jurisdiction. The lodge members change jurisdiction by presenting their lodge regalia and performing a rite while chanting locus electus, meaning the chosen place. Symbolically, they're moving out of the Kingdom Hospital jurisdiction and into lodge law, meaning that they're now free to do whatever they want and declare it legal.
Locus electus. Locus electus. Locus electus.
Near the end of the Kingdom series, the audience discovers that in addition to the Doctor's Lodge operating within the hospital, the actual Masonic Lodge located down the street is also playing a part in the spiritual story of Rigshospitalet. The old woman communing with the hospital's many spirits discovers a tunnel connecting the hospital to the Masonic Lodge. And it's this physical connection that's allowing one of the hospital employees to summon Satan himself into the building, now a welcoming spiritual jurisdiction. My theory is that over time, leaders like England's James I and Denmark's Christian IV may have tweaked legal boundaries beyond simple metes and bounds to define vertical layers of property rights and jurisdiction. It seems that what we're seeing here was that these early attempts to hide ordnance in magazine cellars allowed lawmakers to carve out jurisdictional protections below ground, now defined as an international jurisdiction. And though it isn't proof of what I'm suggesting, this land formerly belonging to the Gamelvartov and Tuborg farms today houses a cluster of foreign embassies. This is land over which the Danish government has no legal jurisdiction. and modern planning regulations admit the legal provisions can be ignored by the foreign embassies in this carved-out jurisdictional section of the city. Why would the Danish government wish to give up national jurisdiction over a specific area? Because it's an easy way to exempt the personal property of certain members of that government from limiting regulations. Laws that prevent all the other people from doing what they wish with their own property. Essentially, it allows the elites, the controllers, to circumvent domestic law, whether that involves decor, commerce, or any behavior considered illegal on home soil. This is most likely the reason why the American CIA was able to fund and direct psychological experiments on Danish orphans, because the experiments were performed within an international jurisdiction, in the Kommune Hospital basement. I'm grateful for any feedback. Please leave your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching.